I'm James Meyer, curator of modern art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Jorge Maki, this evening's speaker, and one of the participants in our new exhibition at the National Gallery, The Double, Identity and Difference in Art Since 1900. Jorge's stunning work, Parallel Lives, an installation of two sheets of glass broken in seemingly the exact same way, is a centerpiece of the final room in the exhibition, entitled The Pair.
Thank you very much, James. I would like to talk first about the work Parallel Lives, and then I will talk about other works that are related to this work in the sense of the double and the repetition or the replica or the echo. The first version of this piece was made in 1996 when I had a residency in Rotterdam, and was part of a show that I called Extremely Recent Works. I produced during these 2 months in this artist initiative in Rotterdam. When I did it for the first time, I imagined something like a couple lying on a bed. And I imagined that they were living together for 80 years and they were facing up. So at the end of their lives, they have copied each other's lines. From this image I had, I think from the beginning, it was not just the show to have the same breaking line on both panes of glass, but there was something like a human background for this piece. In fact, the election of the title, Parallel Lives, maybe is a reference to this story or to this image I had when I started working on it. The title is also a reference to a book of the 2nd century after Christ. When I see this work, I think first moment of chance, so the breaking of a glass, and then a second moment of obsession. Obsession is mounted on chance, or maybe there is a first moment of chance, and then there is an attitude of follow with obsession what was designed by chance. There was another work I did in 2004 that is called Buenos Aires Tour that correspond to the time I decided to settle down in Buenos Aires, or to have Buenos Aires as a base. Buenos Aires Tour was kind of alternative tourist guide of Buenos Aires that was made in collaboration with Edgardo Rudnitsky for the sounds and Maria Negroni for the texts. So this was the box. And inside there were several things. I will not talk about them now, but I just wanted to talk about the way I decided the itineraries of this tour. I put the glass on the map of Buenos Aires, and then I broke it. And then 8 lines were the lines of 8 itineraries around the city, with 46 spots apparently important touristically. I say apparently because they were not important at all. I wanted to bring this work to this talk because, as I said before, Parallel Lives was made first with the first moment of chance, and then with the obsession of copying what was designed by chance. In this case, it happens almost the same. So there was a glass that was broken on the map, and then there was a very complex structure made on the map following the lines of the breaking of the broken glass. Doppelgänger is a work I did in 2005. In fact, it's a series of 10 drawings to be displayed on the wall. This is one of them. This is another one. But what I wanted to tell you is how I decided to start working with it. At that time, I was working with newspapers, and it seems strange now because nobody reads newspapers now. I would say the paper newspapers, physical ones. But at that time, I used to read newspapers, and I was attracted by some stories I found on the newspapers. The kind of stories involving anonymous people that were killed, or they decided to die, or maybe they died in an accident. So they were this kind of stories that they are not important at all, because nobody knows the people who were involved in these killings. And at the day after, these stories disappear from the newspaper. So I imagine these stories are something like fireworks. So they explode for 1 or 2 seconds and then they disappear in the night. So in one moment, so in the beginning of 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, I collected these stories and I did other works. But I wanted to bring this one to this talk, because I selected 10 pairs of news that had some things in common. So, for example, they shared a phrase or a kind of cliche of the writers who talk about or who inform about this kind of stories. In this case, is Deadly Wounded. On the other one is Macabre Finding. These stories also, they had in common that this phrase, that is kind of bridge between these two stories, they were more or less in the same part of the text. So I decided to produce with the two texts some shapes that remind me of the Rorschach tests. So they are something like the meeting of the double, and these two forms, they have something in common, or they have a point in common. That is this cliche, or this very usual phrase. So in a way, you could start reading one of the stories, for example, the one on the left, and then you could pass to the other one through the bridge. These are some paper cuts I did for this work, and this is the final installation of the text. I remember at that time in 2005, there was one art critic who said something that I really liked. He said that if the myth of the doppelganger says that if you find your double, you will die together with the double. In this case, so he said the meeting with the double is followed by the death. But in this case, it seems that death comes before the meeting of the double. These drawings are made out with stories of dead people. I have to say that the doppelganger is a myth that started in the 19th century, and it was very popular in literature and cinema in the beginning of the 20th century. And I remember one tale by Edgar Allan Poe. It's called William Wilson. One man that is followed by another man that is very, very similar to him. And finally, he decided to kill the double. And when he kills the double, he kills himself. Marienbad is a site-specific installation I did for the Lyon Biennial in France in 2011. The curator of the biennial asked me to produce a site-specific piece for a piece of land, trash dump, that was surrounded by an abandoned factory. The biennial took place. Part of the biennial took place. It was in the outskirts of Lyon. So when I saw these photographs, I started to think of a contrast. What would contrast a lot with this piece of land? So the first thing I thought was a rational garden. So these gardens where everything is controlled by the human. And then when I thought of the rational garden, I remembered a film from 1961 that is called Last Year in Marienbad by Alain Resnais. This is the image used for the poster of the film. If you see it carefully, you will find something that is wrong, or something quite mysterious, because you see that all these people there on the central corridor, they are casting shadows, but not the trees or the bushes or the statues. There is something mysterious. There is something seems to be ghostly. And in fact, this is the feeling you have when you see the film. You feel that all these people that live or they are in a very luxurious hotel, they are something like ghosts, and they move something like in parallel realities. They don't communicate very much in between, and so they have a very strange cohabitants of the hotel. So when I saw this, when I remember this garden, I proposed to the creator to reproduce a part of this rational garden in the center of this trash dump, and this was the result. What I like in this project is that you feel that this is something like a Photoshop edition, but it is not. So it was real. And in fact, you could walk around. But if you see the image, if you see this photograph, you feel that this garden is in the wrong place. It is also in the wrong time. So it is a kind of ghost as the people that were living in that hotel in Marienbad. This photograph is interesting to see how the garden was surrounded by the factory, by the abandoned factory. Preludio is another site-specific installation I did in the city of Bariloche in the southwest of Argentina. What I decided to do was to make a replica, the top of the needle of the cathedral of Bariloche, that in fact is very close to the lake. Here is the original needle of the cathedral. In this case, you see the cathedral here, and this is the place where it was placed. And in this photograph, you have both the replica and the original. At that time, I remember I decided to read again the stuff of a Preludio by Debussy that is called The Sunk Cathedral. Maybe you know it. In one moment, I came back to this stuff because it is a piece I tried to play. I tried to play for 30 years, more or less, without success, I have to say. But anyway, it is a very important book for me, and it was a very important piece for me. And when I was working on this installation, I realized there was a part of the staff that said, like an echo of the phrase "listened before." This is something like an instruction that Debussy gives to the player, because in the beginning of the piece you have the theme, the main thing of the Preludio, that has to be played fortissimo, but in the end of the piece, the same theme appears and has to be played pianissimo, so very, very soft. And to describe this effect, Debussy says it has to be played as an echo of the phrase that was listened before. And when I read it again, and I think I realized it for the first time that this phrase was something that reflected a lot my way of working. So it became something like a statement for my work. In fact, I consider that this instruction is something like the statement of my work, that is full of symmetries, repetitions, echoes. When I did this piece, I thought that being the cathedral, the tallest building in Bariloche, in this town, the emergence of the replica of the needle from the lake, it was something like the first sign of an emerging city that was exactly the same as the original one, that was emerging something like 150 meters away from each other. La Virgen Extraviada, or the Lost Virgin, is on one hand a performance with no public. So it was a performance that nobody saw. And at the same time, is the name of a book. It's a book that I wrote to talk about this performance of this trip. You remember I talk about the the cathedral in Bariloche in the south of Argentina. The trip was more or less here. I will show you here. So Bariloche is here. These are the Andes and the frontier between Argentina and Chile. There is a sculpture of the Virgin in the cathedral in Bariloche that I knew it was a replica of another sculpture that was in a very small island called Quinchao in a town called Achao. And this original sculpture, the one on the left, came from Peru in the 17th century. And it was a gift for a mission that was very close to Bariloche. But this mission was destroyed by the people who lived there, that were living there before the Spanish people came. These people, they burnt the mission and they killed everybody. But when they saw the image, it seems that they were afraid. And so they decided to wrap it in leather and leave it. The people from the other side of the Andes came to the place, and then they found the burnt mission. All the people died there. And then they found the sculpture wrapped in leather. So they decided to bring it to Chile, and they installed it in a church and give the sculpture the name of Virgen del Loreto. In 2003, some historians, they realized that this was the same version that was in the mission in Bariloche. So they decided to make a replica of it, and they sent it to the cathedral in Bariloche. It's difficult to believe, but this is a replica of this one. They seem to be quite different, but in fact, this is a replica. My performance started in Bariloche, where the replica was. I crossed the Andes, and then I arrived to Chiloé, to the town of Achao, where the church and the original sculpture was. And then after arriving there, I came back by the same way. It seems to be a quite unuseful performance, but I realized it was interesting to link the replica with the original and do the same way back. During this trip, I took some notes. And then during 1 year, I decided to write some texts that finally were part of this book. So this book has 3 parts. One part is just some writings about the trip from Bariloche to Achao. But there are also references to other works of my production that are also related with the replica. And also there is a third part that talks about some autobiographical situations that were also related to this theme. When I was invited to take part in the exhibition The Double, I thought that this book is something very related to the theme. In fact, it is the theme of the book La Virgen Extraviada. This was one of the pages. In fact, there is a reproduction of this painting by Magritte that I find it is also very related to the show The Double. Well, this is the last work I will talk about. It was a site-specific installation that I did in collaboration with architect Nicolás Fernández Sanz in Buenos Aires in 2017 at the Galeria Ruth Ben-Sakar. That is, in fact, my gallery in Buenos Aires. I have to tell you a story about this gallery. So before, it was in the center of Buenos Aires, of a group of underground parking. So the ceiling was very low. They had columns, and you had this air that has to come inside the gallery pushed. Then in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, everybody was happy with the space. But from the 90s and in the 2000, the artists became aware of the space of the gallery, and they were more interested in the relation between the works and the environment. So we started pressuring the gallery to move from the city center to another place, to a bigger space. So finally, the gallery moved. That was not in the city center. The space was completely different. So if in the first gallery we had all the artificial light, here is artificial light mixed with natural light. So the ceiling is very high. The air, you had no columns. So everything was more clear. At the same time, we had the artists of the gallery had some stress thinking about the production of new pieces for this space. But anyway, we were very happy at that time. So when the gallery moved in 2014, I started thinking of a project for this new space. And finally, playing with the plans of the two galleries, the old and the new, I came out with a project that consisted in installing the old gallery inside the new gallery. I would say installing the space of the old gallery inside the new gallery, because in the beginning the idea was to install a kind of model of the old gallery in the new gallery. So this model will be made in wood, and the scale was 1:1. So in this moment, I decided to call the architect that made this new gallery, Fernandez Sanz, and we worked together in this project. And we realized that that the old space didn't fit very well with the new space, because sometimes there were some intersections. So these are the two galleries, in red, the old one, and in black, the new one. And as you can see here, there are some parts that don't fit exactly with the new gallery. For example, this part also. So finally, we decided that this kind of uneasiness was very important for the project. It was something like both spaces were not very at ease with each other. So this was the aspect of the installation in the space of the new gallery. So you see these two white walls, and these are the original walls of the new gallery, and the rest was everything made in wood, representing all the aspects and all the details of the old gallery. And here you had all the details. So the columns, also some small benches, and you have all these tubes that were used for air conditioning. But there is one aspect that I think is very important. The light is coming from these spots, but in fact they seem to be spots because they are holes. So through these holes, you have the light that is coming from the ceiling of the new gallery, and also from the electric artificial light. So in a way, the old space was lighted by the new space. You could see the structure of the ceiling of the new gallery. We decided to call it diptycho, but it's not a normal diptycho. In normal diptycho, you have one piece beside the other, but in here you have one piece inside the other. For 2 months, the old space and the new space were cohabiting the same space or same spot in the city. And there were two spaces with the same name, but corresponding to different times. I felt that this gallery was, I would say the model, the installation, was something like a ghost appearing in the new space. And this ghost was there for 2 months.
First of all, Jorge, thank you. That was really, really fabulous. So clear. And I'm even happier that you're in our show and speaking to us tonight than when I started. Very impressed. You know, one of the distinctions I make in the text that I wrote for the book is that some artists are doublers, what I call doublers. They can't get away from the double. It keeps coming back in their work. And it's kind of infinitely interesting. And of course, the nature of the double is its porosity, its infinitude. It doesn't stop. It can be psychological. It can be about the doppelganger. It can be about the original and the copy. So many of the themes that you've explored in your talk are absolutely sort of part of the double. They are integral to the double, and that the double is infinite. You just can't stop it. And some artists really can't get enough of it. And in the show, we've got certain artists like Marcel Duchamp. You know, to me, the king of doubling in modern art. He has 8 works in the show. We've got Boetti. He has 3. We have Eva Hesse, 2 works. Warhol is a doubler. Felix Gonzalez Torres is a doubler. Ronnie Horn is a doubler. And you, it seems to me, Jorge, are also a doubler. And what that means is it's pervasive in your work. Where there are other artists who make one work or a couple works and then they move on. But again, doublers are those who keep working through the double. So my question is why do you think that it's of such use for your work, of such fascination for your work? You know, is there some particular psychological or intellectual reason for you? I would note that, of course, a famous doubler is the Argentine writer Borges, who writes the story Borges and I, where he ends up saying, you know, I didn't write this page. I'm wondering, you know, where is this coming from for you?
Well, this is something very difficult to answer, and I think the book I show you, the La Virgen Extraviada, or the lost version, was my way to try to explain to me why I was working with this double effect. I have to say that I have no idea. But if I go to my readings, for example, I talked about Edgar Allan Poe, and when I was 12, I read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe, and I remember that William Wilson was one of my favorite. And so you can ask, I can ask myself why William Wilson was one of my favorites. And I have to say that I have no answer for this. And sometimes I think that maybe it is better not to have an answer for this. Is what I say sometimes to my students. Sometimes it's better not to know. So we are obsessed with the idea of canceling, of giving something like a rational answer to everything, and sometimes it closes the mystery. Maybe I am always working or talking with something like I am talking about ghosts. I am talking about mystery. So they are something like 19th century themes. So I can see it very clearly, but I have no idea why it happens, why it is my interest. And as I repeat, I prefer not to know.
Artists who are most interesting are driven by these impulses that are not necessarily explicable. And just in response to you, I've been asked, why did I spend 12 years working on this exhibition? And I'm not quite sure why either. So we're alike in that regard. One of our listeners was very interested in the book that you reread for your Preludio, was it by Debussy? You showed us a composition. Tell us about
Yes,
it.
it's a composition that is called the Cinq Cathedral. In French, is the La Cathédrale Engloutie. It's a preludio that was written by Debussy in 1911, I think, or 1910. It is based on a leyenda, or a tale, of a city that was surrounded by the sea, and in one moment the gates are open, and then the sea floods the city. So the legend said that in the moments of calm, you can still listen to the bells sounding from the bottom of the sea. So Debussy wrote this piece following this image, so the sound of the bells. And when I talk about this piece, and I talk about the theme that appears in the beginning and then appears in the end, the score, the staff says that you have to play fortissimo first and then pianissimo, as if you were listening to the bells from the bottom of the sea. I find that the story is beautiful, and the piece is also beautiful. So when I was 20, I came across this piece, and from that moment on, I tried a lot of times to play it, but it's quite difficult.
Are you a conceptual artist? And one could ask, what does that mean now in 2022? Of course, that term we often attribute to Sol LeWitt, Paragraphs on Conceptual Art, 1967, and other essays of that period. Would you put your work under the sign of conceptual art now? And what would that mean?
Because some people say I am a conceptual artist. I don't agree at all. What I would say is that we artists, we are producing our work in the beginning of the second millennium, and we are bringing together lots of references. And I find that for me, conceptual art is so important as other influences. I realize that sometimes my work has something like the aspect of conceptual art, but I don't feel I am conceptual artist. I am based on all my works start with an image. So usually I don't start with ideas. So maybe this is why I don't consider myself a conceptual artist.
What are you working on now? You've been kind enough to present a sequence of your work, but there's a lot more than the works that you were kind enough to discuss around the double theme. Tell us a little about what you're doing now.
Well, it is important to say that this selection of works that I presented here is not the whole. So I work in different things, and sometimes very different things. Something like is a crossing between pop-ups and Alicia Clark, and I don't know. Well, I am working on that. It's a very formal kind of work, so it's nothing related to the double, or nothing related to works with newspapers. I don't know. I prefer not to be a monolithic artist. Maybe I don't know if you understand this. So I prefer not to be recognized by my image. So I try to be open and prepare for new things, and not to be all the time repeating the same image.
What do you mean by image? Do you mean a style of working? Do you mean a profile of yourself? Oh, that's what a maki is. That's a maki. What do you mean?
I prefer not to be recognized. Because I think that sometimes I think about my work and I feel that there are lots of different images and lots of different kind of works, ranging from video installation, site-specific things, painting, watercolors, and I like to be moving from one side to the other, because I think that that the important thing in visual art happens underneath. So you have all the images, and this is something like the surface, but the important thing is happening below, underneath. So maybe this is why I am not aware of changing styles and changing supports and all this. This is why I say that I prefer not to be recognized by style, for example.
Going back to the parallel lives, to the actual double glass piece at the National Gallery. Couple questions. I don't think our listeners quite know how you made them. How did you accomplish that piece, first of all? And secondly, the question of, did one come first? Did one come second? Yes, but does it matter to a viewer when she sees the piece?
Well, once I made a talk in one of my shows, and this piece was there, and somebody asked me, how did you do this? And then somebody from the audience said, wow, this is very easy. You put one glass on the other and then you break it, and then both are the same. I feel this is a fantastic idea. The only problem is that it doesn't happen. So it is very easy. In fact, I don't know if it is so interesting, the explanation of how I did it, because I think it's much more important the effect it has in your mind. But anyway, what I did was to break one. So I created an accident on the first sheet of glass, and the second one was created by cutting the glass following the lines of the first one. But then there were some accidents when cutting the glass. So when there was an accident, so there was, for example, another line, accidental line in the second glass, I copied it on the original. So finally, it is quite difficult to say which was the original, because they were copying each other in the process of doing this work.
Okay, so when the glass cutter made the second one, and that took a long time, right? It took.
Well, I did it several times, and I did it myself, in fact.
Oh, I thought you hired a glass cutter. No, you did it.
No, I did it myself, and so it takes a long time, yes, and you have to be very calm, because if not, it's impossible to do. If you are anxious, this work it doesn't work.
So there's not a before and an after, a first and a second, an original and a copy. They are made simultaneously.
Well, if you see it very, very, very carefully, there are some signs that say to you which is the original, because when a glass is cut by accident, the cut is cleaner, and when you cut it by hand, you have some so the lines are not so perfect. But this is something I would notice, or maybe a glass cutter would notice.
One of our listeners mentioned that one of our guards at the National Gallery had pointed out to them that actually they are really different, that if you look really closely, they're not totally identical. Was that part of the idea, or it just happened?
It just happened.
Yeah.
Well, this situation to find two sheets of glass broken in the same way is quite difficult. But to be extremely the same is impossible.
Mm. One of the wonderful aspects of the double is in our show is that one work could be in one section, or it could be in another section, what I call the porosity of the double. And I had some time figuring out, well, where am I going to put Jorge's piece? Because it could have been in the first section, which is seeing double, where you have sometimes the same motif or the same work created twice. So the famous Rauschenberg Factum 1 and 2, the works that look exactly but not exactly alike that he made simultaneously. The two Gorky self-portraits with his mother, same motif and yet slightly different, or quite different actually. So I thought, well, it could go in there. But in the end, we put your work in the final gallery called The Pair, which is about couples, desire, collaboration, with works by Felix Gonzalez Torres, Ronnie Horn, Gilbert and George, and other sorts of pairs and duos. So a more anthropomorphic arrangement is where your work is and concludes the exhibition.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for coming. And from Buenos Aires remotely, we're thrilled by this event and again to have your work in the show. Thank you so much.